Hi everyone, I'm Nina Kaskar, or Miss Scarlet in the Study, and welcome to another episode of Blinded by Nostalgia. This is the series where I take our childhood entertainment and review it now as an adult. So today's topic was suggested by Harry Middleton, and I had actually never seen this before. We're going to talk about Big Bad Beetleborgs. After a little bit of research, I decided to sit down and watch Season 1, Episodes 26 through 31, which covers the SHADOWBORG arc of the series. I've heard this is sort of comparable to the Green Ranger episodes of Power Rangers, which I reviewed in a previous episode. So let's just jump right into the fun, morphing, comic book fighting, haunted housing mess that is this show. The first thing that introduces us to the show is the theme song, and I actually think it's pretty catchy, but it did tell me that this show is targeted towards a much younger audience than I originally thought it was. This is almost like a stepping stone between Bear in the Big Blue House and Power Rangers. This episode doesn't waste any time with getting into the action because right after the opening credits, we're thrown into the middle of a Beetleborg fight, and they have these fun comic book style pow, flash, boom graphics, which I actually kind of love. It separates these fights from a more martial arts based fighting where you're watching the choreography the whole time and makes it more of a lighthearted, fun comic book kids show. We are then introduced to all the characters, and I am so glad this is formatted like a children's show because you can jump into the middle of a season and know exactly what's going on. So these kids live in a haunted house with traditional monster characters and their friend Flabber, who was responsible for turning them into the Beetleborgs. Joe, Drew, and Roland go investigate a noise, and what do you know, there's a hot guy hiding in their ceiling. They introduce themselves to the new kids and don't really question why he was in their ceiling, but okay. So while this is going on, the bad guys are plotting to use Beetleborg technology to create a new, evil Beetleborg. I don't love these villains. I definitely don't feel like they're an actual threat, and at this point in watching, I just had my fingers crossed that we'd have more fight sequences, or for this evil Beetleborg to be somewhat cool. The kids are working at Zoom Comics, and I have a lot of questions about child labor laws in Charterville, by the way. Cool guy Josh walks into the store, and this girl Heather falls head over heels just looking at the guy, and I'm already fully invested in this relationship. We refocus back to the evil lair where SHADOWBORG is ready, and yeah, he's already a million times cooler than the Beetleborgs will ever be. Back at the mansion, Flabber fixes Drew's broken Beetleborg armor with a snake. I don't get this one. I'm gonna move on without questioning that too much. So SHADOWBORG shows up at the house, and while everyone's panicking, we cut back to Zoom Comics where my favorite couple of all time, Josh and Heather, are hitting it off, while it also confirms that these kids are being paid in food in order to work at the store. Joe and Roland leave to go meet up with Drew to help fight SHADOWBORG, and they are going to now Borg. I cannot express how disturbed I was by this morphing sequence. It was like the cover of those Animorphs books, and I just don't know how I feel about it. I was really hoping for some cool fighting to make up for that awful morphing sequence, but all I got was this awful banter.
This was bad news! He's gonna wish he stayed in bed.
SHADOWBORG eventually shows these cocky kids what's up by stealing their suits and therefore taking away their powers. What a badass. So the kids sulk about this for about 5 seconds while Flabber serves them what I can only assume is just straight up dry ice. And then they realize that they still have their powers even without their suits. The episode ends with a to-be-continued scene as Drew stares angrily at Josh and Heather while they walk off happily into the sunset. We open the next episode with literally the whole town forming a mob in front of Zoom Comics to get the latest issue of the Beetleborgs comic. While Heather, Josh, and Drew exchange looks that confirm that this is definitely the weirdest love triangle I have ever seen, a siren goes off signaling that the entire town, who by the way is still crammed inside of Zoom Comics, is in danger. Josh decides to help Heather, and they get dramatically split apart in the crowd, and Heather gets her leg hurt, and he sweeps her off her feet and takes her to the hospital. Girl, I'm not gonna judge if you faked that leg injury. Joe, Drew, and Roland try to fight the SHADOWBORG with only their powers and no armor, which turns out to be
not very impressive.
Like, how much actual power is their armor giving them? Like, they've got levitation, super strength, and super speed. What more do you need? SHADOWBORG then turns them into little frozen beetle pops. No, that's actually what he called them. Somebody wrote that into the script.
Little frozen beetle pops. Now that's what I call cool.
And instead of just leaving them there frozen, SHADOWBORG melts them and then flies away. You could have won if you just left them there. Maybe SHADOWBORG has the biggest heart of us all. Now, I really do think that this episode solidifies the main reason I didn't enjoy these episodes. We just saw a Borg fight, and the kids have all said that they need to get their armor back as soon as possible by talking to Flabber, but instead, they end up at the hospital checking on Heather, who is clearly in much better hands with this cool guy, Josh. If I was SHADOWBORG right now, I would burn down the whole city because these kids have no sense of urgency in this situation. This story will be concluded in a total of 6 episodes, which could definitely have been condensed into 2. I mean, the rest of this episode alone is just the kids disrespecting their monster roommates, Flabber playing charades with them instead of just telling them straight up what's happening, the kids breaking into a comic book artist's studio, and, oh yeah, a Scooby-Doo chase. In a lighthearted ending to this episode that accomplished absolutely nothing as far as storytelling, Art Fortunes, the comic book artist, draws a new white blaster beetle that is going to defeat SHADOWBORG. They decide on Josh Baldwin to become the new Beetleborg, and the episode ends with whatever this is supposed to be.
You too, Granny Cakes!
We pick back up where the bad guys have now taken all of the Beetleborg comics and they stop for donuts because no matter how evil you are, donuts are still important. The cops sitting at a nearby table literally just steal these guys' donuts for evidence. And again, because donuts are very important, the bad guys forget about their whole wheelbarrow full of Beetleborgs comics. Back at the house, Drew is still salty that Joe and Roland want Josh to be the new Beetleborg, but eventually he gives in. Josh does this to impress Heather, and honestly, I understand why she's swooning.
It can happen.
They bring Josh back to the house to convince him to be their new teammate, and what do you know? Another Scooby-Doo chase! I actually don't think this show's script is that bad, but these visuals do not help. After a whole afternoon of scaring Josh into becoming the White Blaster Beetleborg, he only changes his mind once he sees the full drawing of the suit. That's all that convinced him. Not being chased around a haunted house by a literal werewolf. This suit is what convinced him. And thank goodness, we finally get to a fight. I've been waiting this whole time for some sort of action sequence. Here it is, we've got it. And Josh has not trained, therefore this fight is not good. SHADOWBORG kicks butt again, and even though Josh didn't do anything, he somehow managed to get the Beetleborg gems. So this show isn't horrible by any means, but at this point in watching this for the first time, I was really wondering why this was classified as a superhero action show. This episode especially doesn't really progress the SHADOWBORG storyline and focuses mostly on kid drama, which, don't get me wrong, I love, but I just don't think it's a good balance for me to enjoy this, where I'm clearly expecting some badass action sequences. So here's a quick recap of the first half of this episode that has absolutely nothing to do with anything. Josh is in school and Flabber causes him some trouble. Josh crashes his bike. Drew gets salty because Josh is better than him. Flabber gives a heartfelt apology to Josh, and the monsters play Go Fish. Okay, so now that the important stuff is out of the way, we can get back to the main story. Art Fortunes draws a new weapon called the Thunder Stinger that only the blue Beetleborg can use. And before I continue, can I please have a moment to express my excitement in seeing this new Beetleborg's transformation that was a million times better than that Animorphs thing we got earlier? I was beyond thrilled to see this, and it almost made watching the whole first half of this episode worth it. Now, the build up to this fight is definitely dated, but at this point I was just so happy to see an action sequence I didn't care in the slightest. And to add to my excitement, the Thunder Stinger actually works. Drew zaps these enemies back into their comic book, and now we're in business. Now here's a good example of how I think this show should have been constructed more often. We're in the middle of a fight here, which is super cool, but this is also still a kids show. So in the middle of the fight, we cut back to Flabber at the house doing a bit that serves as comic relief between fight scenes. This works. This is how they should have done it for the rest of the episodes instead of ignoring the plot to favor comic relief. I was just so ecstatic to see this. All the Beetleborgs, including Josh, are at the end of the fight with SHADOWBORG, and they have somewhat of their first win. We start episode 30 on a completely unrelated topic. Everyone in the house has fleas now. Also, more Scooby-Doo chases. Drew and Josh have the most manly fight I have ever witnessed, before Roland interrupts with an actual idea to beat SHADOWBORG. Now, I feel like we keep going in circles with this SHADOWBORG arc. Like I said, this could have already been wrapped up, but we get to watch the kids chat about how they're going to beat SHADOWBORG instead of actually doing it. So after another painfully long first half of the episode, they realize they need to get the energy axis in order to save the day. Drew and Josh go to a cemetery to raid some tombs, you know, just some regular kid stuff, until they eventually find the energy axis. But more importantly, the monsters got rid of their fleas! In the final SHADOWBORG episode, we open up on Charterville one more time, and we get 5 full minutes of the kids restocking the shelves at Zoom Comics. And even more exciting, we get more of the Josh, Drew, Heather love triangle in case you forgot that was a thing. Fast forward through some extra comedic fluff, and we actually get a decent final battle. There's actually some good choreography and practical effects that make this entertaining. I just wish that there was more of it in the previous 5 episodes. When SHADOWBORG is destroyed, Josh loses all of his powers, and the best he can do at this point is just hide behind a rock. The kids eventually defeat VEXOR, and they threaten him by saying if he ever comes back,
We'll be ready!
This episode actually wraps up the story pretty well. Good wins over evil, we get a heartfelt goodbye from Art Fortunes, and some more lighthearted comedy to finish out the episode. It is now time to decide whether Big Bad Beetleborgs fans are blinded by nostalgia. Yes. Overall, I don't think this show holds up in any capacity, but I can see why people who grew up with it would have liked it at the time. I think as someone who is watching this for the first time in 2020, it was hard to get through. I just don't think that this show has that much of a draw to an audience outside of kids that were under the age of 10 in the 90s. There are bits of the show that I genuinely enjoyed, but based on these 6 episodes overall, I definitely think that Big Bad Beetleborgs fans are blinded by nostalgia. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please hit subscribe so that you don't miss out on the rest of the Blinded by Nostalgia series. If you have a favorite TV show, movie, or game from your childhood, leave it in the comments below and I might do an episode on whether you are blinded by nostalgia or not. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, my lovely people, and I will see you in the next video.